"You bought me. Finish what you started," she whispered. But his choice shocked her the first time she realized how fragile her life had become. She was sitting alone in a small, dimly lit room. The walls were bare except for a cracked window that barely let in sunlight. She could hear the faint sounds of the city outside, people laughing, cars moving, life continuing as if she didn't exist. She had learned to stay quiet, to make herself small, and to avoid drawing attention. Every sound she made, every step she took, seemed to matter. Her heart had grown heavy with a mixture of fear, exhaustion, and resignation, a feeling that had been slowly settling in her chest for years. She had not imagined that life could ever lead her to a place like this. She was not born into poverty, not exactly, but life had a way of pulling her down. Jobs were scarce, bills piled up, and each day felt like a battle she was losing. She had done everything she could, worked late hours at multiple jobs, saved every penny, tried to plan for emergencies. But somehow, no matter how careful she was, life kept demanding more. And then came the debts, the late notices, the calls from people who wanted their money. It was as if the world had decided she owed it something she could never fully pay. In that dim room, she thought about how she had gotten here. She remembered her mother, who had always warned her about the dangers of trusting too quickly. Her mother's voice was gentle yet firm. "Never let anyone make you feel less than you are," she had said. "There are people who see only what they can take, not who you really are." At the time, she hadn't fully understood the weight of those words. Life seemed simpler then. But now, sitting on the thin mattress, listening to the hum of the city, she understood completely. The day it happened was not marked by any dramatic event. There was no loud confrontation, no fight, no sudden danger. It was simply a meeting, arranged through a series of formal steps that were meant to make everything seem legal, even proper. A man whose face she barely remembered offered her a deal, an agreement that she could hardly refuse. The details were complicated, full of terms and conditions, papers she was asked to sign. He spoke calmly, almost kindly, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that told her he expected obedience. She signed the papers because she had no other choice. She signed them because she was afraid. The moment she realized what the agreement meant, a chill ran down her spine. She was no longer just herself. She had become part of a transaction. People had made arrangements over her life, her labor, and her freedom. The words were difficult to say out loud, even to herself. She had been bought. It was a legal term, yes, but it carried a weight far beyond anything she had imagined. She was not just in debt. She was part of someone else's plan, someone else's possession. And yet, at that moment, there was no one to comfort her. No one to explain why life had become so cruel. She could only sit there, trembling, and try to make sense of it. The man who had bought her was quiet after the papers were signed. He did not raise his voice, did not laugh, did not make threats. He simply looked at her with an expression that was almost unreadable. She had expected anger, impatience, or even malice. Instead, there was calm. That calm made her even more uneasy. It was a calm that suggested control, a calm that said he had thought this through far more than she had. She wanted to speak, to ask questions, but her voice caught in her throat. What could she say that would make any difference? The agreement had been made. Her fate, at least for the immediate future, had been decided. Over the next few days, the reality of her situation began to sink in. She had her own life before this moment. Small joys, routines, people who cared. But now everything felt distant, almost impossible to hold on to. She moved through her daily tasks mechanically, as if she were watching herself from a distance. the apartment she shared with a friend felt different now, almost foreign. Every familiar corner seemed to remind her that she was no longer entirely free. Even the smallest decisions, what to eat, when to sleep, how to spend her time, were overshadowed by the weight of the agreement she had signed. She began to study him, the man who had entered her life in this strange and unsettling way. He did not speak much, and when he did, it was always measured, precise. He had the look of someone who had everything planned, someone who understood the rules of this world better than she ever could. At first, she was terrified, imagining all the ways he could take advantage of her situation. She had grown up hearing stories, reading stories, about people who were trapped by circumstances beyond their control. Now she was living one of those stories, and yet there was something she could not explain, a hesitation in him, a pause in his actions that hinted he might not be as cruel as she feared. The nights were the hardest. Alone in her small room, she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant sounds of the city, and imagining what the next day would bring. Fear had become a constant companion, and yet, within that fear, a quiet part of her began to observe him, to watch for moments that might suggest kindness, moments that might suggest choice. She was cautious naturally, but slowly, she realized that he treated her differently than she had expected. There was no cruelty, no rush to control. It was as if he had his own rules, rules that did not entirely align with what she had been told to expect. Her mind often wandered back to her mother's advice. She remembered the words about not letting anyone make her feel less than she was. For years she had tried to hold on to her dignity even when life pushed her down, and now, in this strange, frightening situation, she realized that dignity was something she had to protect more than ever. She could not afford to give herself entirely, not yet. She had to watch, to learn, and to understand the man who now had such a strange power over her life. Days turned into weeks, and life settled into an uneasy rhythm. She began to understand the rules, the boundaries, and the expectations. She realized that fear could not govern every moment. She had to find strength within herself. Even in a situation where she had little control, she discovered a small but powerful truth. Her mind, her thoughts, and her courage were still hers. She clung to that truth like a lifeline. And then, one evening, as he handed her a simple task, something inside her broke free. She looked at him, the words forming in her mind even before she could speak them. She whispered softly, almost inaudibly, "You bought me. Finish what you started." The words were not a plea. They were an acknowledgement of the situation, of the fear, and of the life she had been forced into. She did not expect him to respond in any particular way. She was ready for cruelty, for command, for harshness. But he did not respond with any of those things. He simply paused, looked at her, and the tension in the room shifted in a way she could not understand. That pause would linger in her memory for years to come, a moment that hinted at something beyond fear, something beyond the transaction that had brought them together. In that pause, she realized that the world might still hold surprises, some frightening, some hopeful, but that even in situations that seemed impossible, human choice still existed. And for the first time in a long time, she felt the smallest flicker of hope. After that tense moment, she spent the next few days in quiet observation. The man whose presence had once filled her with fear seemed different. He was still quiet, still careful in his words, but there was no rush to assert control. Every interaction felt measured, as if he was testing something inside himself, just as she was testing him. She began to notice small gestures, small moments of consideration. A nod when she finished a task, a calm tone when he spoke instructions, a patience that she hadn't expected. Each of these gestures, small as they were, chipped away at the fear that had become a part of her daily life. She learned to pay attention to his patterns. He had routines like most people, but they were precise, almost meticulous. He would wake early, make himself a simple breakfast, and go through his day with an order that seemed unshakable. She realized that his life, like hers, had limits and expectations, even if those limits had been imposed in a different way. Observing him gave her something to hold on to. She felt a strange comfort in the predictability of his actions. If she could understand his habits, she might be able to navigate her own place within this new reality. The tasks she was given were practical. She cleaned, organized, and managed things around the house. It wasn't easy work, but it was familiar enough to give her a sense of control, a reminder that she could still contribute and accomplish something. She began to notice small details in her environment, the way sunlight fell on the floor in the morning, the faint creak of a door hinge, the smell of fresh wood and coffee in the kitchen. These details reminded her that life continued, even in circumstances she had never imagined. The world was larger than the small room she had once feared, and slowly she began to breathe again. One evening, while preparing a simple dinner, she caught herself thinking about the past. Memories that had been buried under fear and exhaustion surfaced. Memories of childhood laughter, family dinners, and quiet walks in the park. They felt distant, almost unreal, but they reminded her of who she had been before life became so complicated. She realized that even though she had been forced into this situation, she still carried herself within her. Her past, her values, and her sense of dignity had not been taken from her. They were still hers. Despite these moments of reflection, there was always the tension in the air. She could feel it in the pauses, in the careful choice of words, in the measured way he looked at her. The unspoken rules between them were clear. Each had their place, their role, and yet there was something unspoken that hinted at possibility. She did not understand it fully, but it made her cautious and curious at the same time. She realized that she had been expecting cruelty because it was all she had known, but perhaps there was more than one way to interact within these circumstances. Her fear had begun to shift. It no longer dominated every thought. Instead, it became a background noise, something to be aware of but not consumed by. She found herself planning small things, how to move efficiently from one task to the next, when to ask questions, when to remain silent. She realized that control was not always about power imposed. Sometimes it was about knowing your environment and understanding how to act within it. This knowledge gave her a small but growing confidence. As days passed, she also began to notice his reactions to her words and actions. He did not react with anger or impatience, even when mistakes were made. He corrected her calmly, explained his expectations clearly, and gave her room to learn. This surprised her at first. She had been prepared for harshness, for reprimands, for moments where she might feel small and powerless. Instead, she found that there was a patience in him that seemed almost unnatural in her previous experiences. It challenged her assumptions and made her think differently about the situation. One afternoon, as she was arranging items on a shelf, she accidentally knocked over a small stack of papers. They scattered across the floor, fluttering like leaves caught in the wind. Her heart raced immediately, expecting a sharp reaction. But he simply looked at her, a quiet expression on his face, and said, "It's all right. Take your time." That simple phrase, so ordinary in other circumstances, felt monumental. It was a permission she hadn't realized she needed. a reminder that mistakes did not have to mean punishment. It was a small act of kindness, yet it made her feel seen, human, rather than just a participant in a transaction. The next weeks were a mixture of learning and reflection. She began to understand the boundaries of her role and the expectations placed on her. Yet, within those boundaries, she found moments of freedom, small decisions she could make, small actions that were entirely her own. These moments reminded her that even in a situation she could not fully control, she still had agency. She could choose how to respond, how to feel, and how to navigate each day. It was empowering in a subtle, quiet way. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room, she felt an unfamiliar sensation: curiosity. She wanted to understand him, the man who had brought her into this life, who had the power to control so much, yet chose not to wield it harshly. She began asking questions about his past, his work, his routines. He answered simply, without unnecessary detail, but with honesty. Each answer gave her a small piece of understanding, a glimpse into the man behind the calm exterior. She realized that fear had kept her from seeing the full picture. There was more to life than survival. Even as trust began to develop, she remained cautious. She had learned that kindness could be deceptive, that appearances could be misleading. But she also realized that waiting for cruelty to appear at every turn prevented her from seeing opportunities for connection, for understanding, for small moments of humanity. She was learning to balance awareness with openness, fear with observation. It was a delicate process, but it gave her a sense of progress she hadn't felt in years. One night, as she lay in bed, she reflected on the strange shift in her feelings. The man who had once been a source of fear had become, in small ways, a figure she could observe without immediate panic. His actions, his patience, and his quiet presence were teaching her lessons she had never expected. She realized that life was not just about being trapped by circumstance. It was about responding to what was in front of you, learning from it, and finding your own strength. The whisper from weeks earlier, the words she had said in a moment of fear and defiance, "You bought me, finish what you started," came back to her mind. At the time, she had expected a harsh response, a command or an assertion of control. Instead, he had paused, leaving her words hanging in the air. That pause had felt strange, confusing, even unsettling. But now she began to understand it differently. It was a moment that had planted the seed of change, a seed that was slowly growing within her, teaching her that outcomes were not always predetermined, that fear did not have to dictate every reaction. As the days passed into weeks, she continued to adjust, to observe, to learn. Her role was still defined by the agreement she had signed, but within that structure she was discovering a new sense of agency. She realized that understanding and observation were tools as powerful as any control or command. By learning about him, his habits, and his patterns, she could navigate her world more effectively, protecting herself while remaining true to her values. And though fear remained, it no longer dominated every thought. There was a cautious hope emerging, a sense that perhaps life could surprise her, that human choice could matter even in the most unlikely situations. The tension between fear and hope, between control and freedom, became the rhythm of her days. Each moment, each observation, each small interaction was a lesson in patience, courage, and understanding. It was during one of these quiet evenings, as she organized papers and listened to the distant hum of the city, that she realized something profound. The world she had feared so deeply was not entirely cruel. There were choices, moments of understanding, and unexpected patience that could change the way life unfolded. And within her there was strength, awareness, and a quiet resilience that no agreement, no transaction, no fear could take away. Weeks had passed since the whisper that had hung in the air, and she could still feel its weight. "You bought me. Finish what you started." The words had been spoken in fear, almost as a test, yet they lingered in her mind. She had expected him to respond with force, authority, or even anger, but instead he had paused. That pause had been unsettling, but now she began to realize it was deliberate. It was as if he had been waiting for something, not just to see her reaction, but to see her as a person, not just a role to be filled. Her days had settled into a rhythm. She rose early, completing her assigned tasks with careful attention. She learned to anticipate what he would need before he asked. She cooked, cleaned, and organized, but she also began noticing patterns in his behavior. There were mornings when he would linger over a cup of coffee, staring out the window for minutes, lost in thought. Sometimes he would speak quietly to himself. Sometimes he would hum a tune she didn't recognize. These small glimpses into his private world fascinated her. She realized that beneath the calm, precise exterior was a man who had layers she couldn't yet understand. Despite the calm, she could feel tension building within herself. She had been trained by life to expect cruelty, to fear that those with power would always exploit it. Yet each day with him contradicted her expectations. He did not demand more than what was agreed. He did not take advantage of her presence. He treated her as someone capable of mistakes, someone worthy of patience. It was disorienting. She had expected fear to be the constant companion of her life, but now a strange feeling crept in, curiosity. She wanted to know him, not in a naive way, but to understand why he chose to act differently than anyone else she had known. One afternoon she was rearranging books in the small study when he entered the room. She froze, expecting an immediate critique. Instead, he watched her quietly, arms crossed, his expression neutral. She felt exposed, as if every movement was being evaluated. Then he spoke, simply and calmly. "I trust you to finish that properly." The words were brief, almost ordinary, but they carried a weight that she could not ignore. It was not just trust, it was recognition. He was acknowledging her effort, her presence, and, most importantly, her humanity. This moment sparked something inside her. She began to test the boundaries, not in rebellion, but in careful observation. She asked questions, small ones at first, about how he wanted tasks done, or why certain things were arranged in specific ways. He answered, sometimes briefly, sometimes with explanations that revealed a little more about him. He never scolded, never showed irritation. Each interaction taught her something new, not just about him, but about herself. She realized she could ask, she could observe, and she could respond. Even in a situation that had once felt like a cage, there was room for learning, adaptation, and, surprisingly, connection. Despite these small successes, the memory of being bought still haunted her. It was a shadow that followed her, a reminder of vulnerability she could not escape. She remembered the fear she had felt when she signed the papers, the chill that ran through her as she realized her life had been reduced to a transaction. She had never imagined that she could exist in a space like this without constant oppression, and yet here she was, surviving, learning, and even adapting. The contrast between fear and small freedoms created a tension that made every day feel heavy and significant at the same time. Then, one evening, a moment arrived that would change everything. He had asked her to bring him some papers from another room. As she walked toward the door, her mind raced. She remembered the words she had spoken weeks ago. the fear behind them. Without thinking, almost as if compelled by some inner force, she whispered again, "You bought me." Finish what you started. This time it was not a test but a statement, a challenge, a surrender and a declaration all at once. He stopped in his tracks, turning to face her fully. The air between them seemed to shift, charged with unspoken tension. She expected him to respond immediately, to assert control in some way. But he didn't. He stood there silently, his gaze steady, almost unreadable. She felt her heart pound in her chest, anticipation and fear mixing in equal measure. The pause stretched, seeming to last forever, until finally he spoke. And when he did, his words were nothing like she had imagined. "I won't," he said simply. "I won't finish what you think I should." The shock hit her in waves. She blinked, unable to process the words at first. "What? What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. She had expected anger, force, or at least a lecture. Instead, he spoke calmly, almost kindly, yet firmly. "I entered this arrangement for reasons that were practical, not personal," he explained. "I did not pay for control over you. I did not pay to take from you what is yours. Whatever you think you are owed to me, it is not that. You are not a transaction in the way you believe." Her mind raced. For years she had been conditioned to expect exploitation, to believe that those with power would always take what they wanted. Now here was someone who had the opportunity to do so, yet he chose restraint. The idea was almost impossible to grasp. She had lived in fear of being owned, being controlled, being forced into submission, and yet, in front of her, that expectation crumbled. She realized she had never encountered this before, someone with authority who chose not to abuse it. He continued, his tone steady. "I will not finish what you think should be finished. I will not take from you. You have your life, your freedom, and your choices. That is something I cannot and will not take from you." She felt her legs weaken slightly, as if she could no longer stand on her own. The intensity of the moment, the realization of what he was saying, was overwhelming. Her mind tried to find a reason, a catch, something that explained his refusal. But there was none. There was only his choice, clear, deliberate, and entirely unexpected. Tears pricked her eyes. She had not cried in weeks, not since fear had become her constant companion. Now she cried not from sadness, but from the enormity of the revelation. She had expected cruelty, and instead she had received respect. She had expected control, and instead she had received a choice. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, yet it also lifted something from within. A sense that life could be more than survival, that human dignity could exist even in impossible circumstances. In the days that followed, her understanding of him and the arrangement deepened. She realized that this choice he had made was not an act of pity, nor of obligation. It was a conscious decision to act differently than anyone else in her life would have, and in that decision she found a strange kind of freedom. She could breathe without constant fear. She could move without constant tension. She could exist without the assumption that she had been reduced to something less than human. Yet, even with this newfound understanding, she remained cautious. Life had taught her that trust was earned slowly, that even kind intentions could hide pain or disappointment. She observed, listened, and tested boundaries carefully. Each small interaction became an opportunity to learn about him, about herself, and about the possibilities that existed even in situations she had once thought hopeless. She discovered that human choice could defy expectation, that kindness could exist where she had only expected cruelty, and that life could offer moments of hope, even in the darkest circumstances. By the end of that week, she had changed, not in dramatic ways, but subtly, almost imperceptibly. Her posture carried less fear. Her steps were measured with confidence, not caution. Her voice, though still quiet, held more authority. She understood now that her life, though constrained by circumstance, was not defined by fear alone. She could act, she could choose, and she could exist in ways that no one could take from her. And in the quiet moments when she reflected on that unforgettable exchange, she realized something profound. Sometimes, the most important choices are not the ones made by the people who have power over you, but by the people who decide not to abuse it. That refusal, that deliberate restraint, had changed everything. It had rewritten the expectations she had carried for years and opened a door to a life she had not imagined possible. After the moment of revelation, life did not suddenly become easy. The man's refusal to finish what she thought he would had shaken her in ways she had not expected. It left her questioning everything she had believed about people, trust, and control. For years she had lived under the assumption that fear was inevitable, that those with power would always take advantage, and that the world operated on the principle of domination. Now she had seen something entirely different. Someone choosing not to follow the expected path, someone choosing restraint. And that choice had changed her perspective entirely. At first, the change was almost impossible to understand. She felt a strange mixture of relief, confusion, and even suspicion. Was he testing her? Was there a hidden expectation she had missed? She had grown up learning that nothing in life came without a price. Everything that seemed like kindness or understanding usually had a hidden agenda. And yet, in the days that followed, she saw no signs of manipulation or coercion. He treated her consistently, respectfully, and with a quiet patience that was completely new to her. This patience gave her a chance to breathe. For the first time in weeks, she could wake up without the weight of fear pressing down on her chest. She could make small decisions without anticipating immediate punishment or disappointment. Simple things: what to cook, how to organize a space, or when to speak, suddenly felt like choices, not obligations. She began to notice herself thinking in new ways. She was no longer planning just for survival. She was planning for efficiency, for clarity, for a sense of calm she had long forgotten. As the days passed, she also noticed subtle shifts in her emotions. She began to feel respect, not just for him, but for herself. She realized that she had endured difficult circumstances and had survived, not by surrendering, but by observing, adapting, and maintaining her dignity. That survival had value. Her resilience had a weight, a presence, and the man's unexpected decision had highlighted it. She felt a quiet pride in herself, even in the midst of the uncertainty surrounding her. Yet trust remained a complicated matter. Though she had experienced his restraint, she knew that life could still be unpredictable. She watched for inconsistencies, small signs that might indicate hidden intentions. She learned to ask questions carefully, choosing her words to avoid conflict, but still seeking understanding. Each small success, each moment of recognition, was a step forward in her awareness. She realized that trust could be rebuilt slowly, piece by piece, through observation and careful interaction. One evening, while carrying out a routine task, she paused to look at him. He was sitting quietly at the desk, reviewing papers with careful attention. The calm concentration on his face reminded her of the pause he had taken weeks ago when she had whispered those haunting words. That pause had been a turning point, and now she could see it as more than a simple hesitation. It had been a choice, deliberate and meaningful, that had altered her understanding of what power could be. She realized that power did not have to be cruel. It could be tempered, guided by respect and restraint. She began to reflect on her past experiences, comparing them to what she was witnessing now. She thought about the people who had taken advantage of her, the moments when she had been forced into situations against her will, and the fear that had shaped every action. The contrast between those experiences and her current life was stark. She saw clearly how expectations could be wrong, how assumptions about others' behavior could mislead, and how resilience and observation could allow her to navigate even the most uncertain situations. In the following days, she started noticing his subtle gestures, the way he gave her space to act independently, the way he acknowledged her efforts, and the quiet patience he maintained even when things were imperfect. These small behaviors were powerful, demonstrating that human interaction did not need to be harsh or controlling to be effective. She realized that the world could offer unexpected kindness, even when it seemed impossible. It was a revelation that changed the rhythm of her days. Her own behavior began to shift as well. She became more confident in completing tasks, more attentive in observing small details, and more willing to take initiative. She discovered that by acting thoughtfully and deliberately, she could influence the flow of daily life without overstepping any boundaries. This was a subtle power, not a forceful one, but it gave her a sense of agency she had not felt in years. She began to feel a sense of control over her own experience, a freedom that came not from external authority, but from internal understanding. One afternoon, while organizing supplies, she paused and reflected on the man's decision not to assert control. It had been a simple choice: refuse to finish what she thought he should, but its impact was immense. It demonstrated that even small acts of integrity could change someone's perspective, could reshape expectations, and could foster respect and trust. She realized that this moment was not just about him. It was about her own perception of herself, her life, and the world around her. Even with this growing understanding, challenges remained. She still felt moments of doubt, moments when the old fear crept back. She questioned whether she truly deserved this patience, this respect, or if it was only temporary. But she also learned to observe these doubts without letting them control her. She realized that uncertainty was a natural part of life, and that responding thoughtfully rather than reacting with fear was a way to maintain her strength. Through this process, she developed a deeper understanding of human choice. She saw how decisions, even small ones, could shape relationships, influence behavior, and create unexpected outcomes. The man's refusal to act as she had expected was not a dramatic gesture. It was simple, deliberate, and consistent. Yet, its effect on her was profound. It taught her that power did not need to be feared, that human interactions could be based on respect, and that she could navigate her own life without surrendering her dignity. She also began to recognize a subtle change in her emotional state. Where fear had once dominated, there was now a cautious hope. She could imagine a future where interactions with others were guided by understanding rather than coercion. She could imagine a life where small acts of patience and integrity mattered more than control or authority. These thoughts were new and sometimes disorienting, but they were also liberating. In the quiet moments of the day, she would reflect on the past, the present, and the possibilities of the future. She realized that the world was not simply a place of fear and survival. It was a place where choices mattered, where integrity could shape experience, and where patience and understanding could alter expectations. She understood that her own actions, decisions, and observations played a role in this dynamic. By acting with care, thoughtfulness, and awareness, she could influence outcomes in subtle but meaningful ways. As time passed, she noticed her interactions with him becoming more fluid. There was no longer the constant tension of fear. Conversations, when they occurred, were respectful and purposeful. Tasks were completed with mutual understanding rather than rigid expectation. She realized that the relationship, though defined by circumstance, had shifted into something more balanced. It was not about ownership or control. It was about cooperation, understanding, and cautious respect. By the end of this period, she felt a quiet strength growing within her. She had faced fear, observed behavior, and learned to navigate a situation that once seemed impossible. She had witnessed a choice that defied expectation, and in doing so, she had discovered resilience, dignity, and agency within herself. She understood that her life, though shaped by circumstance, was not entirely determined by it. She had the capacity to respond, to observe, and to act in ways that protected her while still respecting the humanity of others. And though the journey was far from over, she knew one thing with certainty. The man's choice, simple as it seemed, had opened a door to a new understanding of life, trust, and self-worth. It had shown her that even in the most challenging situations, human choice mattered, kindness mattered, and resilience mattered. She had learned that freedom could exist not only in circumstance, but in the quiet strength of observation, patience, and careful action. The days after the shocking choice continued to unfold slowly. She had watched him, observed his actions, and learned to understand him in a way she never thought possible. She realized that trust was not built in a single moment, nor was it destroyed in one mistake. It was a collection of small actions, of quiet gestures, of choices made consistently over time. His decision not to finish what she thought he should had been the first spark, but the following days had shown her the weight of that choice, how deeply it could shape her own understanding of herself and the world around her. Life began to feel lighter, though not without its challenges. The routine remained, the responsibilities were still there, and the agreement she had signed still defined certain limits. But for the first time, she moved through her days with a sense of awareness rather than fear. She had begun to notice her own growth, the way her thoughts had shifted from survival alone to understanding, planning, and reflection. Every action, even the simplest ones, became more deliberate. She realized that in learning how to respond rather than react, she had reclaimed a small piece of freedom. One morning she woke early and paused by the window, looking out at the rising sun. The streets below were quiet, the city just beginning to stir. She thought about the life she had lived before all of this, the days of constant worry, of fear, of feeling invisible, and she compared it to now, this strange, unsettling, yet revealing period of her life. She realized that the world had not changed. It was still unpredictable, still challenging, still full of people who acted according to their own desires. What had changed was her perception. She had seen what a conscious choice could do, and she understood that life was not entirely determined by circumstance. That morning she reflected on the man who had made that choice. She wondered what had driven him to act differently than she expected.
Was it his principles? His patience?
His understanding of people? She didn't know fully, but she understood enough. The world held people who could defy expectation, people who could act with integrity, even when they could have chosen otherwise. And those people, she realized, were the ones who could change lives, not through grand gestures, but through simple, deliberate actions. As the days turned into weeks, she continued to feel the subtle impact of his restraint. It influenced the way she acted, the way she thought, and the way she saw herself. She began to notice opportunities where before there had only been obstacles. She realized that she could make decisions with care, without fear clouding every thought. She could plan her steps, anticipate outcomes, and navigate challenges with a quiet confidence that had been missing from her life for years. This sense of control, though limited in some ways, felt empowering. Her interactions with him also evolved. They became more natural, less dominated by fear, and more grounded in understanding. When she asked questions, he answered honestly. When she completed tasks, he acknowledged her efforts without unnecessary praise or criticism. There was a balance in these interactions, a rhythm that made life feel predictable in a comforting way rather than restrictive. She realized that trust was growing, slowly but surely, and that this trust was not blind. It was earned through consistent, respectful behavior. One afternoon, she found herself in the small study, organizing documents. He walked in quietly, carrying a folder. Instead of the tension she had felt in the past, there was a calm presence in the room. He nodded to her, not commanding, not questioning, simply acknowledging her work. That simple gesture, almost mundane, struck her profoundly. It was an affirmation of her effort, her attention, and her presence. She realized that recognition did not always need to be loud or dramatic to have impact. Sometimes the quiet moments mattered most. She also began to reflect more on her own feelings. She had learned that fear could be transformed, not eliminated, but transformed into awareness and understanding. She could still feel anxious, but she no longer allowed it to dominate her every thought. She understood that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act thoughtfully despite it. And in observing him, she had learned that integrity, patience, and respect could shape relationships and alter outcomes in profound ways. Her thoughts often returned to the moment of the whisper, the words that had prompted his pause. She realized now that those words had been less important than she thought. The meaning had shifted over time. At first, they had been a challenge, a test, a moment of surrender, but later they became a reflection of her own growth. She had expected control, domination, and fear. Instead, she received patience, respect, and choice. That contrast had forced her to reconsider everything she believed about life and human interaction. In the following days, she began taking small steps to assert her independence within the boundaries she had. She organized spaces in her own way, made small decisions about how to manage her time, and began thinking about the future in ways she had not done for years. She realized that life could be guided not just by necessity, but by thoughtfulness, by planning, and by careful observation. She felt the quiet pride in these small achievements. Each choice, each deliberate action, was a reclaiming of her agency. There were still moments of doubt. Sometimes she questioned whether the calm she now felt would last, whether the world would return to a pattern of fear and control. But she had learned to respond differently. She observed, assessed, and acted with intention. She understood that the world was unpredictable, but that she could navigate it with skill, patience, and awareness. Each day became an exercise in balance between trust and caution, freedom and responsibility, fear and hope. One evening, as she prepared a simple dinner, she paused to reflect on the journey she had been through. The fear, the uncertainty, the expectation of cruelty, all of it had been a part of her past, shaping her into someone cautious, careful, and resilient. And now, through observation, patience, and unexpected restraint from another, she had learned something new. That choice, integrity, and respect could change the way life felt. She realized that the world was not entirely cruel and that human decisions, even small, deliberate ones, could have profound consequences. She also began to consider her own role in this dynamic. She had survived through observation, learning, and careful action. She had paid attention to behavior, understood boundaries, and acted with thoughtfulness. She realized that she too had choices. She could respond with fear, resentment, or mistrust, or she could act with awareness, patience, and dignity. Each choice mattered, shaping her experience and her understanding of life. In time, she recognized that this experience had transformed her. She had moved from fear to awareness, from submission to cautious confidence, from expectation of cruelty to understanding the power of restraint. The man's choice had been the catalyst, but her response had been equally important. She had learned that freedom was not just the absence of control, but the presence of thoughtful action, careful observation, and deliberate decisions. She had learned that resilience, dignity, and agency could exist even in the most constrained circumstances. Finally, she understood the true meaning of the words she had whispered all those weeks ago. They were no longer a plea or a challenge. They were a reflection of her journey, from fear to understanding, from expectation of harm to recognition of choice, from survival to cautious hope. She realized that she had been bought, yes, but that ownership had never been what she feared. The real lesson was in the decisions made by others and by herself, the choices that allowed respect, dignity, and humanity to persist even in difficult circumstances. And as she looked at him one quiet evening, she realized something profound. The man's choice had changed not just the way he interacted with her, but the way she saw the world, herself, and the potential for human kindness. It was a lesson she would carry with her forever. Even when life was challenging, even when fear threatened to dominate, she knew now that human choice could alter outcomes, create respect, and foster hope. She had been given a rare gift, the opportunity to witness integrity and restraint, and to respond with her own strength and dignity. In the weeks and months that followed, she continued to grow. She learned to navigate challenges with care, to act with awareness, and to observe the world around her with a new perspective. She understood that her life was not defined by the circumstances into which she had been placed, but by her responses, her choices, and her ability to maintain dignity and agency. The experience had changed her profoundly, teaching lessons she would carry forever. That patience, integrity, and respect could reshape lives, and that courage was not the absence of fear, but the presence of deliberate action despite it. And in that quiet understanding, she finally felt the weight lift from her shoulders. She had survived, learned, and grown. She had been bought, yes, but her humanity, her dignity, and her resilience remained entirely hers. The man's shocking choice had given her more than she could have imagined. It had given her a new way to see the world, to see herself, and to believe in the power of human choice.